And thank you very much for joining us today to ISC Research's Supporting International School Students with University Entrance Plans During Coronavirus webinar. We have people joining us from all over the world, so welcome. My name is Diane Glass and I'm your host today. I'm Commercial Director at ISC Research. ISC Research tracks the world's international schools market. We gather and supply intelligence, data and analysis to support international schools in many aspects of strategic planning and development. And we support international officers and international departments of universities around the world, as well as pathway providers, by providing them with the resources to connect directly with international schools and their college counsellors. Part of the work that we do is help connect the schools with the universities and vice versa. Right now, most of our work is related to the impact of coronavirus. Our field researchers, who are based around the world, are monitoring market changes as best they can. They're talking with school heads when it's possible, and building a big picture of the impact that coronavirus is having on international schools right now and how it will likely impact them longer term. There are some exceptional stories of resilience and adaptability by some international schools and many examples of the sharing of resources and good practice. Welcome to our speakers. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jennifer Matthews. Jennifer is Director of International Admissions at Syracuse University, New York. Kieran Broadhead is Executive Director of Student Experience at the University of Southampton in the UK. Kyra Kellerwan is now an international education consultant. She is a former international schools college counsellor, and prior to that was an international officer at King's College London, so understands the challenges and needs of both sides of international undergraduate mobility. For those of you listening, please do post your questions throughout the webinar. I don't think we're going to have time today to actually answer the questions during the session, but we're going to be sharing your questions with all of the panel, and we'll respond to all of those questions in the blog after the event. The other thing I should say is that having practiced this webinar a couple of days ago, I think that we may well run over time. So apologies for that. There's so much great content here that we want to hear from all of our three panelists, and there will be a recording for everybody after the event if you do need to dip off early. So if we could begin with you, Kyra. Could you sum up for us, please, to begin with the key pathway challenges for both international schools and international officers at this time?
Sure. Hi, thanks Diane for that great introduction, and thank you to everybody who's watching and taking part. So the key challenges I think are quite similar on both sides. I think all of us right now are sort of going through a bit of a period of uncertainty and grief in many ways, saying goodbye to the world as we knew it. We're certainly seeing fear and uncertainty on both sides in schools and in universities about policy changes in education in all of the major countries that our students are usually considering. We're seeing insecurity about travel and making travel plans, and of course the visas associated with that travel. We're seeing a great need to pivot and to be adaptable and to change quickly on both sides. Varying levels of communication too. So in some schools, as you've mentioned, you know, there's a great sort of sense of unity and really good communication. In others, you have parents feeling a little bit lost and students feeling fearful. And I'm sure that that's the same on the university side as well, that, you know, according to the way different teams are being run, you have different amounts of information filtering through at different times. So that can be very challenging. I heard a great term coined by Joan Liu, who's one of my sort of counselling heroes at UWC in Singapore, and she coined the term geo-swerving to sum up the kind of changing minds that might be happening right now with parents and students alike. So, you know, I had planned to study in country X, but of course now I'm reconsidering everything. What other country should I be going to? Should I be staying at home? So I think that's a major challenge that we're all facing. And then of course the financial implications of this crisis and the lingering effects that could have on student mobility and on parental incomes is incredibly important for us all to consider. consider. So, you know, we've entered this phase of sort of active wait and see. I really like that phrase. I heard it in an IACAC webinar the other day. And I think, you know, that's sort of the best that any of us can be doing at the moment. I wanted to sort of say that, having said all of that, schools and universities are doing a good job overall. And I think, given what a challenging time it is, the amount of information that's being released in a very timely way, especially with lack of clarity even from government communications, has shown real flexibility. So it seems right that everybody right now is planning for different outcomes, and that's very hard work. So I think that hard work needs to be recognised.
Thanks very much indeed, Cara. Can I stay with you for a moment and ask you, what advice would you give to international school college counsellors in order to best support their year 13, their grade 12 senior students, who are obviously going to be wondering what's going to be happening with their university places for September?
Yes, absolutely. So I've been watching a few other webinars at the moment, and I think there's a real theme coming through of how to mitigate the sort of sense of fear and anxiety that students are having at the moment. A word that keeps coming up is reconciliation, and sort of coming to terms with the fact that this uncertainty might be around for a while. So as counsellors, I really think that our role is to, you know, do three main things: reassure, give reminders, and act as a voice of representation. So talking about reassurance, it's about saying that things will eventually be okay. And, you know, I've been guilty of this. We might say and sort of minimize the fact that teens have a tendency to feel everything deeply, but the loss that they're experiencing is the loss of their imagined futures, and that's very real. So it's still our job to listen to them, to remind them to breathe through it all, and to help them get through what can be an overwhelming amount of information online. There's always been an overwhelming amount of information about college, but now it's even bigger. So our job is to help students assess their options and avoid burnout, and learn to manage their emotions at this difficult point. We can give them reassurance with lots of different things. There are sort of silver linings in all of this. Extended applicant response deadlines, for example, from UCAS being pushed back this year. And in the US, we've seen extended response candidate reply dates given. We've seen clearing becoming something more interesting this year, with more options on the table. And so if students have had a change of heart in the interim, then there are also options for them. We still need to be around to give reminders. And so, you know, our job as the sort of cajolers and naggers in chief doesn't end as school counsellors. Important steps do need to be taken. Deadlines still matter. So reminding students not to neglect the normality, the normal things like checking your email, doing that accommodation application, looking into student finance requests. And then, of course, encouraging them to connect with the universities that they spent all of that time and energy getting to know over the past few months when they were making their applications. So being in touch with the universities, engaging with their colleges of interest, and that might be through a social media takeover. It might be joining webinars, something to feel connected, and to also remind them, of course, to disconnect and care for themselves in amongst all of this. And then finally, I think school counsellors have a real duty. Counsellors actually all over, international independent counsellors as well, have a duty to our college contacts to relay legitimate parental and student concerns. So that means advocating for our student bodies. It might feel like we're advocating for whole countries at some times, but it's important to gather qualitative data and feed the student experience back to colleges and HE institutions to help them inform their policy and planning. So, you know, those are the three main roles that I think counsellors need to fulfill at the moment: to be a sounding board around lots of questions, and obviously be there to support our students in an emotional way as well.
Thanks a lot, Cara. Jennifer, could I bring you in here now? I'd like to ask, how has Syracuse University been delivering lectures and providing contact time to your current students since March, when coronavirus first impacted the US?
Sure. And Diane, I'd like to echo Kyra's appreciation for a wonderful introduction. I do want to mention as well that if you hear any funny background noise, of course, they naturally started mowing the lawn outside of my window just recently. So my apologies for that.
No problem.
Anyway, what I did want to say is that this has been, I think, a real exercise in testing the flexibility and adaptability of institutions, which I think most of us would agree historically have been relatively slow to change. In March, our institution made the very necessary decision to suspend residential instruction and transition fully online. We were fortunate that the timing happened to work out right as our spring break began. So we had a little bit of a cushion of time to make that transition, not much, but a little bit. And of course, that decision was necessary to protect the health and well-being of our students, faculty, and staff, and really just the whole campus community. Since that time, our students have been participating in classes online, mostly through Blackboard, Collaborate Ultra, and of course Zoom, which I think we're all becoming quite proficient in these days. Our faculty members have also been making themselves available for office hours as per usual through these tools. And we've been able to maintain our standard academic calendar, and so we were able to prevent any gaps really in that schedule due to that spring break time. The institution was also able to provide financial support to students who needed assistance in purchasing equipment if they did not already own it, so that they could maintain contact with the professors and complete all of their coursework on time. The other thing that I think we've done quite well was we've been leveraging Zoom to continue to provide our student support services. So in particular, mental health counseling. Zoom is a platform that's HIPAA compliant. So anyone who's in the US is very familiar with HIPAA, but HIPAA is a privacy law related to health, the health industry. And Zoom is HIPAA compliant, so we were able to use it to support our mental health counseling services, and of course other things such as academic tutoring, our student life activities. We've actually had a number of really robust online activities. We actually did a digital escape room. So lots of fun things going on to keep our student campus community engaged throughout this time.
Fantastic, thanks. And Kira, let's come to the UK now. What approaches have the lecturers at the University of Southampton been adopting since March?
Well, I find it very interesting. Doesn't the world seem a small place when pandemics strike? Actually, everything we've just heard really applies here in the UK as well. We've seen our university sector pivot remarkably quickly to change the method of delivery that's studying and since time immemorial to deliver online in a way that's been quite remarkable. They've embraced new technologies, mostly Microsoft Teams actually we're discovering in the UK rather than Zoom, which is another interesting challenge. Blackboard Collaborate, using tools to try and work online with students. It's been quite interesting how we've had to address where we were in our academic year and thinking about our academic structure. Most universities, of course, will be offering and running some form of assessment in person. That's all had to go. So many universities have introduced what we would term a no detriment policy, as we have done at Southampton, which has moved to assessment at the whole module level rather than individual pieces of assignment, changed assignment forms to things like open book assessments, or to thinking about longer form written pieces of work. And then alongside that, we've had to completely change the way we deliver learning support as well, because where you may be able to give alternative technologies to students, you're not able to do that quite so readily. We built in an additional week, so we moved and added in an online transition week after the Easter break, whereby students had no formal learning, but we put together sort of within 2 weeks a transition program to enable them to learn online. And as you've again heard from Jennifer, we also put in place online learning grants. We tried to think about how financial hardship would affect those students who may either not be able to go home. So we have still over 1,000 students in our halls of residence who are wanting to be able to complete their year of study, or their degree in fact. And we've also had to be thinking about things like how we get our students graduated into the workforce. So our medical school and our nursing school wanted to get our medics and our nurses at the end of their degree program graduated and out into the workforce to support the pandemic. So it's been quite an interesting time, which has required us to be flexible, less competitive. I think we've been working better with each other across the UK, sharing selflessly with our colleagues. And I'm hopeful that as we cover some more ground, that will stand us in good stead as we work with international students who are thinking to come maybe to the UK this year.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Kieran. So could I stay with you just for a moment and ask you what's your message right now to your incoming students about September, including, of course, the health and safety procedures you might have in place, and what's your plan B if borders remain closed and social distancing remains restricted?
Okay, sort of two parts to that question with two sort of different answers. So the message that we are pushing out from the University of Southampton, and I know that the majority, of course, of our colleagues across the sector are pushing out, is that we're doing everything we can to make sure that students will start. We are starting. There will be a new academic year. The Department for Education in our government is very clear. They would like to see us open for business from what would be September or October. But what I would say is that you asked the question about borders remaining closed and social distancing remaining restricted. I think we're going to have to be 100% honest that is going to be in place. I don't think any of us can see a future where at least social distancing won't remain a part of campus life. So we're having to think very hard about those kind of elements that you would imagine to be high intensity, close physical proximity, which is basically everything a university does. So we are high individual, we have high physical contact, we have surfaces with high touch rates. So if you think of a way a library runs, lots of books are touched, lots of computers are touched, lots of desks are touched. So we're having to plan carefully. We are moving online for an awful lot of our content. So not just our academic content, also our freshers fairs, our careers services, our counselling. We're thinking about how we might be able to do enhanced work in things like sport and wellbeing. So how can we make sure people can still build community, feel part of a university if they start either remotely or not with the sort of full experience you would expect in a face-to-face model of delivery. It's quite interesting at the minute because lots of universities are modelling and scenario planning as we are across the whole world. And we at Southampton are working with our epidemiologists, with our behavioural scientists, our public health scientists and our mathematical modellers to understand how you might safely run a university campus so that we can give our offer holders that surety and parents that we are running a safe environment, that you can feel safe when you enter the university. And there's been some really interesting outcomes to that. We isolated just one of our buildings. We have 85, just one of our buildings. We worked out we would probably, with a normal timetable, have to clean 44 times in one day. So we've been doing some really very detailed thinking about how you'd zone a campus, how you could make it safe. We're also identifying programs where people would have to physically be there. You can't start medical training at our university without being able to do some face-to-face skills learning. So we've got to think about who has to be there and who might not. On the borders issue, of course, we've got to think about how visas are processed. We've got to think about how, maybe the border is open, but there's a 14-day quarantine period in place. So we've been looking at when term dates might start as a result of that, isolating one hall out for people to spend 14 days in. So we've been doing quite a lot of pragmatic and proactive thinking. The challenge is, of course, it's never quick enough. So we've been trying to up our communication with our offer holders and our partners to try and say, we're working through this and be really honest and open. Because I think that's what people need at the minute. They need to know we are working in this space and we're doing things for you and we're committed to giving you a great experience.
Kieran, that's so impressive. Jennifer, could I ask you, how are you preparing your new undergraduates due to begin in September, and including ways to reassure those last minute insecurities that I'm sure many students may have at the moment?
I think that Kieran's basically touched on it in his response, in that it's really critical. The transparency, the regular communication, I think, are two of the really important factors here. As he said, it's never quick enough. But I think that to reassure the students that we are doing the absolute most we possibly can is critical. At the moment, all of our institutions, decisions and actions and our assumptions are based on not only facts provided by the local health authorities and, our national health authorities, but also sort of operating under this, cautious optimism that we will be resuming, residential instruction in the fall. So following that, we're of course always going to be following the guidance and direction of all of our health officials and the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention in all of our decisions. As of in terms of communication, we have communicated that a return to campus in the fall will likely require us to embrace new public health practices and set very new conditions related to the places and spaces that we learn. Just like Karen mentioned that they were doing a study on their campus, we've been looking at all of those sort of similar contingency plans. We will continue to seek to overcome those challenges in ways that are consistent with our commitment to academic excellence. And all of our administrators, faculty, and staff are developing plans for multiple fall opening scenarios, which of course the most central piece of those scenarios is really prioritizing the safety and well-being of our students, faculty, and staff, and the whole Syracuse community. We've been surveying our incoming students, international students, to find out what kinds of contingency plans may be the most appealing to them in the event that they face travel restrictions or visa delays that could prevent them from coming to campus, in the fall. The results of those surveys are still coming in because we just sent it fairly recently, but their feedback is really going to be useful in helping us determine which options are the most worthy of investing our time and resources into. So that has certainly been a big tactic that we've been taking on, is soliciting the feedback.
Fantastic, thanks very much indeed. Kyra, could I bring you back in here now? What would you like to see universities doing to support their incoming international students as the impact of coronavirus continues?
Yeah, well, I'd like to echo what Kieran said about transparency and communication. Both he and Jennifer have mentioned the need to sort of be alert and in charge of sending out information that is the most up-to-date as it can be. So I think I've split my answers into pre-arrival and then post-arrival. So pre-arrival, working together, as Kieran has already alluded to in the UK, there's been quite a lot of collegiate work informing and holding events together in groups. And I think this has been represented by universities across the world, which is great. It's really appreciated by counsellors if you can group together Wheeler or British Council and hold a webinar as they did yesterday, or universities affiliated with the IACAT group have done similar things as well. So making sure that everybody has access to the information at the greatest sort of scale when relevant, of course, that's really helpful for us. Showcasing their online prowess now, I think, is something that could be really, really useful. Obviously, MOOCs are tremendously in demand anyway, just by everyone who's sort of at home relearning and doing new things. But I think the opportunity that this has given to show off great taster lectures, to whet appetites of students, to also have them something to connect with you on, something that doesn't feel like marketing, but it shows your particular brand, your particular style of teaching in an institution, is going to land really well with this generation. And it's possibly a more effective way to help them know than if they would choose to do the first semester at distance or to have more online classes. So I think that's really helpful in making it easier for students to make decisions about where they might learn remotely before they get there. And of course, working to ensure that visa and testing requirements are clearly signposted and are made student-friendly to understand. I've even seen universities making guides for parents as well to help them understand things in the home languages of an international student's family. All of that is really thoughtful and really helpful work. I think it's clear that universities have shown that they can innovate, and they've had to. So continue to do that, I think, is the resounding call from counsellors. You've shown you can innovate with things like acceptance of Duolingo if a student can't make it to take an English test formally, IELTS indicator, etc. Where you can work to be able to continue to remove the stressors for international applicants and continue to use our technology in a smart way to open up access routes. And then I think one of the things I've seen that's worked really well is engaging your current students to talk to offer holders, to help be a voice and a face of the institution. That was working well before. Platforms like UniBuddy have made great work of this in the UK, but connecting your future students with your current students via social media takeovers, etc., is something that's landing really well with students. They just don't have anywhere else to go for that sort of on-campus voice, and I think it's become even more important than ever. And finally, before arrival, consider what financial support is available. I'm heartened to hear the universities talking about supporting students who are currently enrolled. And I think that's also something to consider about, the next wave of students who are coming in. They may be financially affected by this. So see what can continue to be protected in terms of pots of money to help students out who, for whom it may make a big difference when they arrive. And then once, of course, students are enrolled, and I have to say, Syracuse and Southampton are the type of university that are doing this already. It's already been mentioned, but robust online provision that doesn't feel like a second thought is key. And then increased attention to the personal tutor system, to pastoral check-ins, so students, when they do show up, they don't feel lost or isolated. Because if they've turned up from abroad during this uncertain time, I feel that universities owe them a duty of care that's more akin to a residential school in lots of ways. And so helping to build these community touch points now matter. Mental health services provision is going to explode. I think it's going to be vastly needed, and I'm heartened to hear that's already happening. And so, in addition to skill support that's needed from a long period of without formal studies, so academic support in terms of English, but also in terms of mathematics skills and things that are just, were not on the boil while students weren't at school. Those are all things that come to mind, and I think will be increasingly important as we move forward.
That's some great insights there, Cara. Thank you very much indeed. Jennifer, do you think that, are you anticipating a decline in international student arrivals in September, including deferrals, of course? What are your plans for responding to this for the 2020 to 21 year?
Sure, I think this is a question that is key on everyone's mind at the moment. And, I think at the moment, we're fortunate. Our numbers of committed international students are strong at the moment. We do know, of course, though, that there will be issues related to securing visa appointments at US embassies and consulates abroad over the summer. And that has a great potential to impact our students' travels to campus, because even when the embassies do open, there will likely be delays given the backlog of visas that will also need to be processed. Some of our students have been able to secure visa appointments, though some have reported that those appointment slots are not available until late August or early September. And some embassies are not taking appointments until as far out as November. So we do know that this is an issue. We are looking at, of course, a number of contingency plans, plan A through Z, including online instruction opportunities, of course, and leveraging, our study abroad centers. SU has 6 different study abroad centers around the world. We're looking into options of partnerships with other institutions abroad to host our incoming students within their own home country for a semester if they're unable to secure a US visa in time for the fall term. We're looking at these program options as something that we could customize as an institution, select courses in English that are offered on site by our own faculty. We would send faculty and staff over to manage this partnership. And so these are all things that we are considering. And additionally, of course, we have noted that we're going to be flexible with our deferral request deadline later in the summer. We do know that this is something that students are looking at, are talking about. I think we've all seen a number of surveys and coming out through various sources that are indicating this is an increasingly attractive option. And so we will, of course, also be flexible with deferral requests in addition to all of those other things.
Sounds like you are covering off plan A to Z there, Jennifer. Kieran, the British Council reported recently that 1 in 5 international students who've been offered places for September will not be coming to the UK. How are you preparing for that potential challenge?
I think that's a remarkable question and one that's really tricky to answer. If we start at the beginning, firstly, we're accepting students have to make the right choice for them. and in a global pandemic, there's an awful lot of choices that people have to make. They have to feel safe, well, secure, and we've heard about some of the financial challenges people will be facing. So the first thing we have to do is be supportive to those students. They may choose they want to defer their place for a year. They may choose that this isn't the right place for them. And the human bit of us, of course, has to accept that that's absolutely appropriate and right for them. I've already talked about how we're trying to keep close contact with offer holders to explain what we're doing. We believe that a number of, part of the reason people will make a decision not to travel may be around perceptions of public health. And so I think it's really important that universities are very clear about what it is that they're doing to ensure that public health standards are high on their campus, and that students are able to access that support. It still feels very early for that statistic, however, to be totally accurate. We've already seen UCAS move back the dates by which students have to report that they're coming. And our experience is that students are very positive about what university might mean for them at the minute, because goodness knows they've had a fairly rough year this year. And as such, one mother who I spoke to of a prospective international student said to me, well, what else are they going to do? I want them to be able to have their best future possible, and we think this is part of it. So I think we've got to keep scenario planning, keep modelling, and keep delivering provision that's as high quality as possible, so that we can support those students through. I mean, the reality is, if they don't come, we have to manage them not coming, and we hope that we'll see a bounce back in future years. But some of it is tied up with what happens across the rest of the world, if there's second or third or fourth peaks of the virus in other parts of the world prior to treatment or vaccination. So we're watching, we're scenario planning, and we're trying to keep in touch with people.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Now, let's look at future years now, if we could. Jennifer, if I could speak to you, what impact do you think coronavirus will have on student decisions for international higher education from 2021 and onwards?
I think that this is a really important question. I think there's no question in anyone's minds that this is something that none of us were ready for. Prior to the pandemic, the colleges and universities across the US were already starting to see some decline in interest among students traveling internationally for higher education, which generally stemmed from perceptions of our current geopolitical climate and costs related to US higher education. So there was some of this happening sort of on a slower level. My institution is fortunate to be well positioned with a very strong reputation at the tertiary level. So we are going to be fairly resilient, and we have a very wide range of options for students who are interested in studying abroad. But I do think that the reality of this situation, not only for international students, but for even our domestic students in the US, is that the long-term impact of coronavirus on students' college searches is still just unknown. In the short term, I could see more students seeking options closer to home. Many families have been impacted by this sort of rapid need to leave a campus with a little time to plan for such an occasion. And I think that experience is going to have them wary of looking at universities, hundreds or thousands of miles away from home. That said, I do believe that technologies evolved to the point where, an interest in international education will not really be diminished, but I think it's going to maybe considerably go through a transformative period, to maybe a more virtual platform. We currently are seeing a very real need for global collaboration. Scientists across the world are working together to rein in COVID-19. They're working across the globe to tackle environmental issues and climate change, preventing a severe global recession. So all of these issues really need that international perspective, all of the resources and talents that, we all bring together. So while it may look a little different in the future, I do think that there's always going to be a need for international exchange.
Thanks very much. Kieran, come back to you now. Public examinations have been abolished this year because of the pandemic, and This has raised many professional conversations, of course, about the future of exit assessment and evaluation. I'm sure you could debate this for hours, but perhaps in 2 or 3 minutes, could you give us a few key thoughts on whether you think this could result in change for the future, and if so, how?
You're absolutely right. It could be a topic all in itself, couldn't it? So I'm going to even time myself so I don't go over. I think the short version is yes, I think it will. I think that we have to be realistic. There has to be some way of measuring learning outcomes, and we have to be able to grade outcomes in some form. So I think we have to be realistic that there will always be a need for assessment and evaluation, and that has to be made in such a way as to be able to predict the ability for students to succeed in certain spaces and to have the aptitudes that are required. So I think if we position that there will always need to be some form of assessment of learning, then look to what could happen in the future. I think that changes to assessment forms could really enable us to measure learning in a more appropriate manner for university and employment learning in the 21st century. And I have a lot of conversations with professional educators in the university around the fact that, closed book examinations in an exam hall is not something you will do ever again in the workplace in most worlds. It isn't a good way often of trying to measure whether someone's going to be successful in their future life. And in fairness, I reflect on my own experience. I haven't sat an examination like the one I did in my university sports hall ever since I graduated. And I certainly on a day-to-day basis am not asked to not collaborate, to not work in teams, to not think about how I might produce information in a way that's appropriate for work-based learning. So I think there's ways that we can change really well, think about changing assessment forms. I think another thing very quickly that I've got within the UK, we're starting to look at how you might correct for predictions. So how effective are predictions, how good are centres at making predictions, exam centres at making predictions, and how can you adjust for that if you think about performance of students. And that essentially is big data and looking at learner analytics and big data. Now that can be argued all sorts of different ways, but I think for many students, we could use big data and learner analytics as a way to predict success in a way that is much more effective than simply grading out one specific learning element. That being said, we're going to have to be able as universities to measure people's readiness to study in our setting and context in some way, and their aptitude with certain elements. So it may be numeracy, it may be literacy, it may be the ability to play an instrument or learn a language. And so we'll have to think those through, but I think we have got a massive opportunity at the minute. And interestingly, COVID-19 is presenting us with a world of opportunity. We've just got to be brave enough to take it. So in short, we're going to have to measure learning some way, but I do think that we could do something much more appropriate for the 21st century now.
Huge food for thought there, but it is encouraging to be able to spot opportunities for making change in the future that is coming out of all of this. Thanks, Kieran. Kyra, because of your experience working in both sectors as a university international officer and also an international school college counsellor, so you understand both sides of the coin, the aspirations of the students and their families and also the needs of the universities. How do you think higher education will have to change now for the international student sector? And perhaps as Kieran's hinted at, could COVID-19 actually be a catalyst for change that's been needed for a while?
I mean, yes, I definitely agree. I think there's a whole separate podcast episode / webinar on this for you, Diane. I think the opportunity is great, and I think Kieran's right. We do have to be brave in terms of taking risks with understanding that perhaps the way things have been have not served everybody's best interest. We've just sort of been on autopilot. I think the student recruitment as it stands, the world of student recruitment, could really go either way at the moment. It's anyone's guess. And that's why I think the sort of term of, being prepared to actively plan, actively being in planning mode is a good way to cope, because early indicators in the UK suggest that there could be even an increase in applications next year from international students. There's a demographic increase in the UK coming, and of course, international students that don't come this year or that may want to take that gap could bump application figures next year if things go back to quote unquote normal. In the US, I suspect there will continue to be winners and losers, as we've already seen. Colleges that have, a good endowment, a large endowment, may be somewhat protected at the moment. Those with high reputations with international families, they have certainly a much bigger buffer. But then the colleges that have less financial support will have to be very creative, or facing severe cutbacks or closure. And I think, the financial impact of this being felt on international families, we see that here in Spain, in a country that has, already sort of suffered large unemployment, where families were having to put away a lot of their funds to send their students abroad. This could make studying abroad a luxury item again for some families. And if your at-home provision is decent, as is the case in many European countries, then the sort of assessment piece might change entirely, and students and families might be taking a different tack. I suspect, though, that family and parental inspirations won't go away, but they could certainly be deferred due to all of the uncertainty. So I think the word for universities to make sure that they continue to sort of understand the changing nature of this decision making is just to do what Kieran and Jennifer have already been mentioning, which is to be communicating effectively, making sure that families have a reason to stay on course. It is right that this is probably a terrible year to take a gap year in many ways. What will the students do? So starting their university studies and still having a cohort of friends and people their age and learning is certainly going to be attractive still, but making sure that they have a reason to choose your university is, I think, where that technological piece comes into play, and understanding that all eyes are on you online. So continue to make sure that your provision and your voice is really what you want to be heard.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Kieran, can I come back to you now, please? Many international students, they'll refuse to be thwarted by the impact of coronavirus. They'll continue to want to find the best higher education solutions that they can, won't they? I mean, how would you advise teenagers at this time regarding their future planning for their university years?
I think that's a really great question, and I think that you're right that we are seeing within the UK and within my university that people really are really keen. They are committed to the decisions that they've made, and let's be clear. I worry significantly in the world of information advice and guidance that we spend so much time working with students and their families, both sides of the desk, and often working together in partnership to ensure students are making best use of information, that they may have gone through a really robust selection process, that they've thought really long and hard about where they've got to. And we're currently now in May, with September not very far away, and we're starting to think about pivoting decisions after in some cases, really long periods of time making decisions. So I think we've got to be really proactive with students. We've got to encourage them to use the wealth of information that's available to them. And we've heard lots on this webinar already about the fact that we've actually got quite good very quickly at using live chat or webinars. We've managed to move Q&A to live chat sometimes, and students are able still to speak to people and actually ask some questions like, how are you going to make the campus safe for me? Can I still move into accommodation? If I can't, will it be online? When are you hoping that you can get me on campus? It is a buyer's market at the minute in the UK, certainly, and I think globally. We are all forecasting lower numbers, and as such, universities are starting to behave in a competitive manner. So I think I also would advise students that they're really mindful of any pressure or any tough conversations that they have. They've got to make the most positive decision for them. And my final, some students will take a risk, and if you look at the global numbers, the students who haven't got underlying complications or health conditions probably are in a fairly low risk category group, and they may wish to be bombastic and feel that they can go overseas, but their families have to be comfortable with that too. So I'd also be advising that their families engage with us, because we're as well happy to speak to mum and dad about what plans there are for the future as we are to speak to students.
Sure, thanks very much. Jennifer, restrictions on travel and social distancing could remain for the foreseeable future, couldn't they? How are international officers from Syracuse planning to engage with international school college counsellors and students during this period?
Sure. Well, like many institutions, not just in the US, but around the world, we worked very quickly to move a very robust spring visitation schedule online in a very short amount of time. And over the last 6 weeks, we've offered a number of online sessions for both admitted and prospective students and families. We're planning to add a number of additional sessions over the summer to keep our committed students engaged, to sort of assist with that MELD management. The upside to all of this, and this has been mentioned, I think, by both Kieran and Kyra, is that it's given us an opportunity to get more creative with outreach, to differentiate ourselves, in addition to our traditional information sessions, which we hold at both a university-wide level, but also at a college-specific level for our professional programs. We've been offering Q&A sessions with panels of current students, both domestic and international. We've been engaging our alumni network in completely new ways, adding a number of sessions for our student support offices, such as the International Services Office, the Residence Life Office, Health and Wellness, so on. We've really increased the information on our counselor webpage as well. Created a virtual visit request form that counselors can use to schedule university representative virtual visits and request topical workshops for their rising seniors on a variety of applications and admissions topics, such as writing a strong admissions essay, the role of the interview in the admissions process, and so forth. So, using tools just like the ISC International Schools Database actually really make it easier to connect directly with the counselor population and to send this kind of information out to that network and to school heads around the world as well. Many of the counselors that I've spoken to, a number of my friends out in the industry, have also sort of expressed an interest in universities collaborating together to do joint sessions. This would really help ease their schedules and accommodate student instruction time. So, we're going to, of course, be heeding that advice and looking for university partners to, with our peer institutions to be doing joint sessions. But I think it's really important to listen to that voice. Students will have limited time with all of this new online learning system. So we really have to be mindful of that as well.
So amazing stories of new innovations and new ways of approaching the work that you do. Kyra, come back to you now. What advice would you give to international officers about ways to maintain their university's presence and engagement with the international schools during these times of restricted movement?
Yes, I would definitely echo what Jennifer's just said. Working in groups, regional groups, or perhaps research intensive groups makes so much sense. And it still allows institutions to differentiate themselves, but so much of the information that students and counsellors receive is universal. So I wholeheartedly second that. Regular mailings, I think, are really important right now, and usually I'd say send us fewer emails, but at the moment I think it's important to send regular mailings to sort of stay on top of developments as and when they happen. Yes, we can always go to your websites to look at the COVID page, but I think grouping really relevant updates for an entire institution so that we can then forward those out to families and students is really helpful as well. Presence on social media, of course, and events that are not just aimed at counsellors, but also events that are aimed directly to students and parents are all very, very helpful. I think getting international officers to sort of send short updates to their trusted counsellors or to their contacts or agents once a week or so is perhaps not even too much to ask until September, and then after that much less often. Ensuring that your presence on things like this, on webinars, really helps to get the sort of most up-to-date information. And then something that's come up recently is things like finding that contact if we have a question and people are working from home and offices are closed, just ensuring things like technology works for the portals, for housing applications, things like that. When a student has a question about that and someone at the end of the phone is not picking up, it can be quite stressful. So making sure that the technology works, that the website works, and maybe having some sort of emergency contacts so that your teams are still visible, even though we all know we're working in different constraints at the moment. And then finally, working alongside your sort of large national bodies, so good work being done by NACAC and IACAC and by UCAS. You don't all need to create separate videos to say the same things, but it really does help when a country or an education system has a united voice or someone representing the face of study in that country. So, UCAS has done really well to provide a lot of online updates, and I think UUK and the British Universities International Liaison Association has done the same. So that's something that's very appreciated and can help sort of take the temperature of what's going on in the country very quickly for an international family.
That's excellent. Thanks very much indeed, Kyra. Jennifer, parents, I mean, they do play a significant part in the decision making, don't they, when international study is being considered?
Indeed,
What advice would you give to international school college counsellors about supporting parents, particularly those who presumably are becoming more risk averse about future planning for their children's university choices?
I think that even though perhaps it sounds a little outdated at the moment, I still think that the best advice is to advise students and families to find the right fit institution for the students' interests and needs. I do think those needs and interests might change. So it's important to, be broad when you're looking at, thinking about your university search moving forward. And I think Kieran's even mentioned that to some extent in some of his responses, that, the idea of fit really is important, and asking questions of university representatives about the outcomes of their graduates, academically, professional, and personally, is a great way to determine the value of an institution. Knowing that an institution has high success rates with internship placement or graduate program admission, job opportunities, and so on, can really help families make a choice to find something that is a high value for their student. These are challenging decisions to make even in the best of conditions, and how universities have stepped up to meet new needs during these challenges is also an indication of their strength and of their value. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're looking. I also think that it's important, especially in times like these, to research institution support services, things like tutoring and disability services, mental health counseling, which I mentioned earlier, community building activities. I think that it's really important to see, what kind of support they're going to be offering that community, regardless of whether they're, online or in person. Admissions counselors at institutions in the US and around the world are really here to help students. That is our job as admissions counselors, to help their families, to help counselors with their questions and concerns. So please, of course, feel free to reach out to any of us at any time for assistance. Thanks
very much indeed. Another big question for you, Kieran, that could realistically fill days of debate. The role of universities has changed dramatically, of course, in the last 20 years, but the way many of them operate remains rather traditional. Do you think coronavirus will force an operational change for universities? In a couple of minutes, could you highlight 2 or 3 of the changes that you'd particularly like to see across the sector that might benefit international students?
I do think it will force an operational change in the short term. What will be interesting to see is how resilient universities are in keeping that change in place. And it will also be interesting to see how the market responds to the changes that are made. And the reason I say that is I surveyed all of my offer holders and said, how would you feel about some online learning? And 89% of them said, we wouldn't like it, thank you very much. We want to come and undertake a face-to-face traditional university experience. So whilst there's a massive opportunity at the minute for us to embrace technology and do things differently, we do still have a relatively traditional market as well as a relatively traditional set of universities. I also think it's quite interesting when we speak to parents who influence lots of our international students, because they remember what university was like for them and expect it to look and feel and smell the same. It's going to do interesting things to pricing. There's been a number of questions in the question bar. Are you going to knock some money off because you're delivering online? So that will change the operating model of universities. What I think that we should be thinking about is all the really positive stuff that can add value in the short term. So if we think we will bounce back to something that feels a little more like a face-to-face, on-campus university experience for undergraduate students, operating across 2 terms or 3 semesters, starting at one point in the year with everyone together in a hall of residence or a flat or a residence, I would hate for us to lose the really good stuff we've done around using online learning to support, so blended learning, about how well we've managed to pivot to delivering online, so online resources, online chat, online advice and guidance. I think it works better in terms of multi-time zone. I think it is more responsive. So I think we will have to change the way we operate. I think that it will be interesting to see how much of it can stick. And I think we've got a real opportunity to use technology in the future to keep adding value to students and to keep engagement up with our applicants and our offer holders and their influencers.
Thanks very much indeed, Kieran. That's great. So I'm going to say thank you now to Jennifer, Kyra and Kieran for sharing such valuable advice today. We have gone on before the 45 minutes, but it's been massively valuable for international school college counsellors and others who are all supporting international mobility during this very difficult time. If you want to know more about the impact of coronavirus on the international schools market, ISC Research is sharing news and intelligence in various ways, and here are some links that might be helpful for you. Look out also for our latest blogs, which are sharing some exceptional details through the pandemic from our field-based research consultants, as well as good practice shared by schools. Jennifer mentioned ISC Research's online international schools database, which helps international officers to engage with international school college counsellors. The schools database is fully searchable geographically down to city level by curriculum and examinations, level of tuition fees, etc. And there are currently 9,500 international schools and local IB schools teaching students aged 16 plus listed on the ISC database with contact details of thousands of department heads, including college and guidance counsellors, heads of high and senior school, IBDP coordinators and subject heads. ISC's online international schools data portal will enable you to identify all the international schools, understand what sort of schools they are, and help you to engage with your key contacts at the schools. It's a crucial time to be using a tool like this for remote work. And if you're interested in how to develop your business with international schools or university international officers, please do get in touch. You can contact me directly. ISC Research has a number of solutions to help you do this immediately, strategically, and effectively. So thank you very much indeed to our presenters today, and thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Stay well.